Hello, hello, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. It's Dr. Rich Scheibner here, back with you for another stream of Get Writ Live. We're hanging out. We're doing all the good things. Spring has sprung, so I've got a new background here at the top. So just for you all. I mean, I'm hoping that it stays a little warm. I did cycle today, so that was interesting. It was still pretty darn cold, but yeah, it's nice to move into a new season as we wrap up the term. Today we're discussing how to compose a lit review or literature review, often framed in writing studies as entering a conversation. So you are likely working on your finals, your seminar papers, and wrapping up those major projects, dissertations, theses, what have you. And you've likely had to do things like this, working on a literature review. Before we begin our main topic, though, I want to discuss a few items, as is tradition now on the stream and forever will be, as long as we keep doing this. I'd like to once again thank Writing Center Director John Suffren and the Writing Center Department for supporting another term of Get Writ Live. If you'd like to see any of our past live streams, you can find them in two places. Here we have it on YouTube, so the links are right here. Takes us up to it, and so you can see right now this whole thing's going on. I think it actually is. Yeah, if we click on it, it's going on right now. So I don't want to do that to have a little echo or delay. That's a little interesting when that happens. So we have that there. And we also have links on this very page that we're looking at right now. That's in the show notes. You're welcome to check it out at that point. And yes, the cycling wind chill is no joke indeed. It is... as metacognition is saying to us here in the chat. Yeah, it keeps you honest, I think, and for me, it had been about 3 months since I had done any kind of work like that. So really delighted to get out on the move, as we wrap up the term. So should be doing that a lot more coming up. All right, so I mentioned that page. The Writing Center page also has a list of our upcoming live streams for the rest of the winter term, even though we're in the spring. So we did virtual reality last week, and that was interesting. We did, an entire stream where I simulated what it's like to work. And let's just say that trying to live stream and trying to do virtual reality simultaneously requires a lot of processing power. So the second half, I would recommend you watch that part because you get to see really how that works in action. Whereas the first part is all about the setup. Lots of wires, connections, and things like that we need to get writing done, and can be quite difficult to actually establish. But it's a good learning lesson, right? What's at stake if we're trying to do this experimental form of writing? Today we're on literature review. On the 29th, we're doing writing as and presenting. So we have a special guest, Christina LaVecchia, who's joining us for that. And then we have writing as and composing yourself with Carrie Ann Sotavega. So really excited to have all these guests. Today, though, we have Dr. Christopher Morris, who's joining us in just a bit after some preambling about literature reviews. He'll be joining us about noon, and we'll talk about sort of his approaches and also do some hype for his workshop happening tomorrow on anti-racist writing and linguistic diversity and translingualism. So super excited to talk with him. Dr. Morris started with us this past year and academic year, and it's been a real joy to hear about his research and teaching approaches as well. All right, and then finally, just a little shout out to the Writing Center one more time, as well as the Writing Center staff and Writing Department staff, and everyone who really makes this possible. In addition, we also have one-on-one appointments. We have an accessibility specialist. We also have a drop-in sessions and other programming, including workshops like I just mentioned. All these are free, folks. So I gave one last week. Just delighted to see such a great crowd for that. We had about 30 people coming in and out and so forth. And tomorrow we have anti-racist writing, organizing your draft, and revising your sentences over the next few weeks. Where can you go to sign up? Yeah, so it's right here on this page that I'm looking at right now, and I'm going to put the link in the chat for you. Oh, it's not linked to it. Oops. Let's see what's going on with that one. Darn. Let me go back to this. The events calendar may have had a slight glitch, so let me go back to. Yeah, I'll have to drop them a note about that. Perhaps. Oh yeah, here it is, right here. I think. Yep. may have been a bad link. That happens every once in a while. There you go. Right there for you. Linked in the chat. So writing others, reading self, in addition to anti-racist and translingual writing. Okay, so that's 12:30 to 2 tomorrow. Hope you have a chance to check that out. It's great. I was looking at some of the slides and kind of thinking about, some questions for Dr. Morris today. And so we'll be able to talk a bit about that. All right, so let's go to the topic for the day. We're discussing writing as contributing to what some call intervening in a scholarly or public conversation. So these kind of conversations, right, are often in an article's literature review or a review of current research and theories about a topic. So perhaps in seminars and so forth, or for manuscript writing, you've seen sections in articles called literature reviews. For example, this is with my colleague, Sarah Rhetoric. We have a section about intervening in social media scholarship. So it's sometimes spelled out, or it'll say critiquing scholarship. Essentially, what literature reviews are a summary and kind of synthesis and a moment to intervene in a scholarly kind of conversation. What has the literature said, and what's your contribution to it? Those are the kind of two core questions we often have to ask ourselves and make apparent when we are writing. Now, for undergraduate seminars, usually I don't require this sort of depth of literature. Like I want you to be citing sources and so forth, or tell me what your framework is that you're using to analyze a particular text or an object. And so parts of this are in there. I think as you get into more advanced and manuscript writing, this is one of the core pieces of doing scholarship, because you have to, I think, at least in this Western kind of context, you have to assert yourself or establish yourself. And so, yeah, that's a good question. Intervene equals disrupt. Some people have framed it as an interruption into like a long-standing conversation that needs to be sort of shifted. So sometimes literature reviews can be framed as a bit more, how we say, aggressive, or some may frame it as a building on of. So yeah, I'm kind of thinking about how the language plays out in a way that may frame it as a disruption or a productive disruption, is interesting to kind of think about. Yeah. So you're kind of like, let me interrupt you real quick and give you my thoughts on this. There's a way of thinking about that, but then intervening, it has a kind of interesting tone to it, right? I don't know. I kind of go back and forth on how I want to, I guess, cast it as negative or something, but I think it's just, we are asserting or introducing ourselves into a conversation, but intervening is typically acceptable and something I find that it has some neutrality to it, but it's still saying, I'm joining you into this. I'm entering this conversation. Okay. So what do I mean by this a little further? I just, I ran this through like right before the program. I wanted to put it in Chat GPT because I don't know, just lately I've had some new ideas turning around in my head. Now that I've finished one project, I'm kind of like in limbo between what my next projects are. So in Chat GPT, I just said, write a literature review about scholarship on city cyclists and their embodied movements. So like, how do we use, sort of hands and signs and things like that to assert ourselves? And I'm going to just run through this really quickly to give you a sense of the shell that they're sort of presenting, and kind of think about it as a reference point in addition to some of the texts that I've been gesturing, like the piece I did with Sarah Rhetoric and on affective spamming. So this is what they wrote. Cycling has been gaining popularity as a mode of transportation in cities around the world. It offers an environmentally friendly, cost-effective, healthy way to travel. With the rise of cycling, scholars have begun to examine the embodied movements of city cyclists and how their bodily experiences impact their travel choices and experiences. This literature review aims to summarize and synthesize the scholarship on the topic of city cyclists and their embodied movements. Boy, that's a mouthful, right? But what we can kind of think about for this is something I've linked into the chat. This is often how literature reviews start. They summarize where we are and to a topic, and then look to intervene or offer a unique contribution, which is an intervention in the piece. So this is a model. It's also linked in the chat or in the show notes. It's called the CARS model. So creating a research space. You build an introduction. You do a couple moves to establish your territory. So as we saw here, this is a model that this chat GPT is mimicking. It's very typical. Blank has been studied extensively. Interest in blank has been growing. Recent studies have focused on blank. Blank has become a major issue. And if we look at these two, I might be able to actually do this without revealing all my fancy notes behind me. Let's see if I can do this real fast. We can lay them side by side. Let's turn me off. You get to see my face up close. All right, there we go. We will go to the entire screen, and then we will do this. Yeah, so we'll do this one. And then what I can do is actually put these two together. So we pull this one out. We do this, and then always got to think on the fly when you're doing this kind of work, broadcaster and speaker. Okay, so as we see here, cycling's been gaining popularity. With the rise of cycling, scholars have begun to examine the embodied movements of city cyclists and how their bodily experiences impact their travel choices. So language for establishing research territory. That's like where the scholarship is. Yes, there's a whole reason there's a control boardroom in broadcasting. It's the future is this kind of streaming. I may have to think about some kind of research assistant in the future to just run the boards, so to say. Yeah, it's interesting. You know, there are lots of different like triggers and stuff you can do, but yeah, we do what we can for a small establishment. Okay, so establishing the niche and motivation for research. This is by John Swales and Christina Feek. In terms of this CARS model, you're preparing your audience to understand how your research relates to the background you have given, highlighting gaps and problems in current knowledge that justify and explain the need for further investigation. So what we have here is we don't so to say have in this literature review section like that point just yet. I'm gonna go through the rest to see if it actually generated that. Don't think it did. So right here we have a couple citations, and I need to even check if those are real. And so they summarize what has been explained about these about cyclists, citing Scheller and Urey and Rosenfeld, where the expansions come from, and they point out the areas of another area of scholarship, urban design on cycling experiences, for example. And then we have social factors that shaped the embodied experiences of cyclists, as well as potential health benefits of cycling. So I don't know, what we have here really is 4 kind of contours of a lit review. And that's great for establishing the boundaries of what you're going to be researching. So for this literature review, I'm going to discuss previous studies on blank, blank, blank. So urban spaces, impact of urban design, what have you. It's all going to come out. But what you have to do is establish your intervention. So previous studies, however, of city cyclists have not examined this. Like, I would say, just looking at this quickly, and this is what I'm getting to as my own like sort of rhetorical hat I'm putting on, is I would say, while this has been an interdisciplinary approach, previous studies of city cyclists have not examined it from a rhetorical lens. So what's the kind of persuasion that's at stake when cyclists are out? I could say such studies are unsatisfactory because perhaps they have not examined what it's like to be a city cyclist in Toronto, Canada writ large. What's your intervention? What's the niche you're trying to work? Research on city cyclists has mostly been restricted to European cities, to environmental studies. While these are useful, I want to offer a what? Right. Okay. So that's the second move. That's where you do the critique. That's where you start to open up that space to intervene in, right? You look for a fissure in a productive way. All right, so occupy the niche. This is the step of how you are responding to the need for further investigation. Explain how you address the research addresses the need you identified in the previous step, and list your research objectives. Okay, so let's say I've walked through this move. I've said there's a rise in scholarship on cycling with more, greener options, more bike paths, or an interest because of health and safety. We know cyclists are kind of always at risk, when they're out in the world. Certainly, I've had that experience. I have been hit by a car. It's not fun. And so you state that. You say it's unsatisfactory for one reason or another. Then you say, how am I going to fill that gap? This project aims to understand the following questions. What are the rhetorics of city cycling, for example? What are the embodied actions that may be persuasive for cyclists on the roadway? And to answer that, I'm going to do what? The study aims to, the evidence collected from this study, maybe it's interviews, demonstrates that what? So in those three moves, they talk about this for the introduction in STEM fields, but this is a great way to establish the literature, offer what you think is the gap, and then how you're going to sort of occupy that gap that you're claiming is there, right? That is a challenging thing. So, here stress is an ever important factor in the lives of university students. Many of you have difficulty regulating stress and their potential. While the positive relationship between music and stress release has been supported within the general population, little research is done to examine music's effects on the mental health and stress levels of university students in particular. Okay, so we've identified there's little research in a particular area. The question, we're going to do a survey, a multi-stage survey, to answer that question about music in relation to stressful situations. Okay, so ChatGPT, wonderful way of kind of getting a couple things started, but what we don't really have is the intervention. It's one thing to summarize and outline where the literature is. It's another to say, okay, but there is a potential problem, or if you want to frame it in positive terms, which a number of scholars often encourage, so they're not shutting down folks, is to say the current research presents an opportunity to study X or Y. So for me, I've seen a little bit of literature on cycling. There's some great text out there and even books on rhetorics and cycling and so forth. But I've kind of, I'm not prepared to say that that's an intervention just yet, but I think it's starting there. I'm looking at that territory before I can make a claim that there's a need for an intervention. Okay, so that is one prime example that we've got here of how this works. Let me go ahead and go back to my screen so that we can kind of maybe just think about this on one page. And my screen shares. There I am again. Okay. Hello, folks. We'll go back to this entire window and we'll go here. Yeah. But yeah, I wonder if that's a literature review has been framed to you in that way, as a car creating a research space. Now, there are other ways to think about this. A couple other moves we can sort of think about. One thing that professors, across and researchers across rhetoric and writing studies, communication, it's really it's a common, I would say, take my word for it that it's a well-known metaphor and it's been sort of interpreted in different ways. But Burke's unending conversation metaphor, and I will link to this in the chat too, and then the show notes if you're interested in kind of, keeping it as a bookmark for later. But let me just go ahead and summarize this or read it verbatim so we all know where we are. But Kenneth Burke was and still is a widely cited scholar in rhetoric and philosophy studies, often making it into writing studies as well. Number of texts and so forth and theories. He has sort of built and established and have been sustained by scholars for a very long time. Now, this is one of the most popular ones among Kenneth Burke from the philosophy of literary form. He writes about what's called the unending conversation metaphor, or sometimes people call it the Burkean parlor. So as he says here, imagine that you enter a parlor. You come late. When you arrive, others have long preceded you, and they are engaged in a heated discussion. A discussion too heated for them to pause and tell you exactly what it is about. In fact, the discussion has already begun long before any of them got there, so that no one present is qualified to retrace for you all the steps that had gone before. You listen for a while until you decide that you have caught the tenor of the argument. Then you put in your oar. Someone answers. You answer him. Others come to your defense. Another aligns himself against you, to either the embarrassment or gratification of your opponent, depending upon the quality of your ally's assistance. However, the discussion is interminable. The hour grows late. You must depart. And you do depart with the discussion still vigorously in progress. Okay, so just a couple quick things. This metaphor has been critiqued productively for its kind of gender norms, and even just kind of opponents, ways of feeling a bit more like manly, right? As we get into there. But if you kind of look at the main message of this is scholars or, a certain group of, let's say, like debaters, you can think about it as a sort of book club, right? Are in a really intense conversation. And the way I translate that is, and many have, is this is scholarship. This is what scholarship is. Scholars are citing each other's work, building on it, disagreeing, agreeing, qualifying, so on and so forth. That is part of that parlor. That's what the parlor is. If you think of that as the boundary, right? Yeah. Yes, it has a very ancient, yeah, absolutely, like the Republic, right? We're debating ideas in public and even taking a kind of, Socratic method of I'm responding to what you're saying and building on it. There's a lot you can unpack from that, absolutely. What I find interesting about this is this line, then you put in your oar. What does that mean? We've shifted the metaphor a bit. Like, are we at a dock having a kind of dockside conversation, or are we in a parlor, right? Then you step in, or you raise your hand, right? Or you do something, you cough, or whatever you do to respond. And I think that's, we can think about it in many, many different ways that are beyond like just opponents and so forth. So I carry this with me when I'm thinking about it, and often will use this as a base for helping writers think about discussions and how to intervene. So you put in your oar. That's a nice way of saying you interrupt. Excuse me, I'd like to add to this conversation, right? That's one way to think about it. And I think what we saw from the previous example, same thing. Like, there's a long list of literature that you have to work with, or you feel like you have to work with, and you might not be able to find your way into that, right? And like I said, no one can actually retrace the steps for you, which is also very true. I mean, you can't cite everything, and you can't go all the way back to ancient Greece and talking about rhetoric to make an intervention, for example, about city cyclists. You have to pick and choose what you find to be interesting in terms of the literature. What I will say to that is when Sarah Riddick and I were working on this piece, we kept asking ourselves, what conversations do we want to intervene in? We could talk about political rhetoric. We could talk about affect. We could talk about social media and writing, Twitch generally, all that kind of stuff. We decided to focus mostly on social media scholarship. And we found that social media scholarship has a number of pieces on Twitch, but not in the context of writing studies. And we find that to be, important when we're thinking about the role of social media, especially on Twitch, and how emojis might sort of figure into it. So if you check out this piece, you get a good sense of how it works. I think on the York servers, it should come up, but I'm not quite certain. So I'll just put it there if you want to see it. And then defining terms like spam and so forth, making use of it as much as we could, including like things on much scholarship is focused on in social media. It's focused on verbal communications, such as blog posts and similar content. We had some on, visual content, but nothing in the context of Twitch. So we kept making those kind of moves. Can critically engage. We instead of saying such scholarship suggests how digital rhetoric and writing studies can critically engage with multimodal communication, we could have said something like, such scholarship has failed to account for multimodal communication on social media, especially with Twitch. It's just about the languaging that you sort of put forth. Okay. Another thing in terms of metaphors to consider, or constructs we can kind of say, is they say, I say. This is another classic one. Very easy to sort of way of, I don't know, it's a nice formula, right? Like that's essentially what we're seeing in literature reviews too. So they say, I say. It's by Gerald Graff and Kathy Bergenstein. It's gone through 5 editions. It's a fantastic piece. I recommend it for any writer across different academic disciplines, just to think of that as a really nice construct, because you get different constructions of the sentence. I may actually just look this up for a minute. They say, I say, instructions. Okay, so we've got this is the one I used to use. So really great for literature reviews as well. And you might say, so-and-so says this, but I say this. I'm establishing my intervention. Now, let's say if you're in that Burkean parlor, or as metacognitive is saying, you put in your oar, could be putting in the work in a very large boat that's moving towards the social construction of knowledge. Maybe the parlor is on a dock. I don't know, or something. It's a floating parlor. Who knows? You say, excuse me, I love what you're all saying. I think it's very interesting, but I want to say something a bit different. And here's what I want to say. Right. So they work through these kind of templates. On the one hand, which has got some, ableist implications. Cycling, for example, is a very healthy sport. On the other hand, I say this. I say that we have not acknowledged the risks that happen when cyclists are out there. I agree that so-and-so argues blank, and I agree because blank. So I think that X is mistaken because she overlooks X. Right? Think about these constructions could be very interesting to even as just conversation or debate. So lots of ways to kind of work this, but scholars say this, I say this in response. Sometimes I'll even write that. Much scholarship has concerned itself with the environmental implications of cycling, for better or worse. In response, I say this. Lots of ways to construct it. So super interesting. And we have Chris with us. So Chris, I'll bring you here in just a second. So those are some kind of constructions. If you are all interested in looking at that, feel free to. It's there's just many ways to approach these interventions. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that with Dr. Christopher Morris here in just a second. All right, let me go ahead and knock this one down and then we'll go. Okay, here we go. All right. Hi, Chris. Are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. How you doing?
Good, good. How are you?
Excellent. Yeah, I'm so glad you could join us. Yeah, let's talk a bit about your workbook. I'm gonna say a couple words about you, if that's okay. I promise they're all good. Yeah. Excellent. Okay, so for this talk today on intervening in conversations and literature reviews and so forth, I'm really delighted to bring on Dr. Christopher Morris with us. Colleague of mine in the department, started with us this past academic year, and is doing. I'm so excited to talk to you about some of the projects you have underway, and I was hearing about recently after C's and so forth. So Dr. Christopher Morris is an assistant professor in the writing department. His research interests include rhetoric, poetry, technical and professional communication. His current project is exploring the rhetoric of housing and economic development, and some new things underway as well, which we'll talk about. His poems have appeared in Northwest Review, Beloit Poetry Journal. I'm sorry, I can't say that. And then Transition Magazine. But again, I'm just so excited about what you've been working on. Got a PhD from the Ohio State University, not far from where I was from when I finished mine at University of Cincinnati. And yeah, Chris, welcome.
Yeah, it's nice to be here. This is really cool, having this live stream and this sort of supplementary engagement and instruction with students. And the topics are really, they seem useful and a big asset to people tuning in. So happy to be here.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, these get even, I'm trying to make the screens like very, so I'm trying to get it a little larger for us so we can see along with everybody else. There we go. Okay, that'll work. Yeah. Yeah, it's been great. And I think like it just gets even better with conversations like this. So I'm really grateful to bring you on. And, after a busy time, especially in early March with us, or in February with us doing conferences and all that, it was nice to reconnect. So all right. So we talked about a couple questions. Wanted to ask you a couple of those, if that's okay. We can move into that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Okay. Give me 1 second. So I have this. Why is it not showing up on my end? Okay. I think I can see them now. Excuse me. Yeah. It was just multiple screens, folks. We were talking about broadcasting as being a little challenging sometimes when you're doing you almost have to have like multiple arms, so to say, when you're doing it. Okay, so let's get into some questions. And these are things I'm going to learn about you too, that we've talked about like sort of informally, but I think it would be useful to know about. Today it's Wednesday. It's gone quickly. I was wondering if you could tell us about your writing habits and schedule just as an assistant professor. What's worked for you in the last year since you've started with us in July 2022, and even the last few months, like since starting with us at York?
Yeah. So, prior to starting this position, I was a graduate student. I had worked as an assistant coordinator after that in the Writing Center. And, during that time as a graduate student and also as a coordinator in the Writing Center, I was an adjunct instructor. So teaching and balancing administrative duties, it's always sort of been a thing.
Believe it.
Yeah. As a graduate student, however, you have a lot more time on your hand, even if you're teaching a class. Usually you don't, I would say I taught one course a semester, maybe more when you include adjuncting, but usually, the writing time, the writing habits include going to a coffee shop with headphones and very loud music, and sitting there for hours on end. For me, it's best to have a lot of time allotted, like I said, maybe 2 to 3, sometimes 4 or 5 hours at a time, because you need time to sort of let the mind wander in addition to actually typing things out. A lot of times, academic writing, creative writing, you're reading other stuff, you're people watching. So, a lot of times you have to have space for, as I said, letting the mind wander, letting ideas come in, come out, in addition to, hammering things out on the keyboard. the busier you get, the more you have to work to find time. I know
Mhm.
you're one who sets aside sort of structured time every week. I'm a little bit more flexible. I'll find time as I can, but it's still the same principle. Going to a coffee shop usually, or if I'm here at home, shutting myself off from the office or putting on headphones to try to get into a different space. Uh,
Mhm.
as an assistant professor at York, we're lucky enough to get research release, meaning that if you're on the research track, you sort of have more time to do research, which includes writing, of course. And so that's great. Um,
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
uh,
Mhm. Yeah, 2 questions from that. Have you found a preferred coffee shop yet near you that you like to go, to go
yeah,
to and write?
I bounce around.
Mm,
Creed is always a good one.
love Creeds.
Yeah,
Oh,
me
yeah.
personally, I love a good Jimmy's. Any Jimmy's coffee around the city is
Yeah.
great. Um, I don't know. I love the vibe in Jimmy's coffee. When I
Yeah,
first
yeah.
encountered it, when I moved to Toronto, I thought it was kind of corny and strange. It's like they're just a bunch of Jimmy's sort of themed, Jimmy Stewart, Jimi Hendrix, etc. But they're really great spaces, I find.
We're getting stuff, yeah, done. I'll ask everybody too, like what coffee shops they enjoy going to. It's been a minute since I've been to Creed's, but absolutely, I heard they've created like a whole new space, and I haven't been to the new one just yet. So that sounds fantastic. I'll have to check that out. A future writing date, we'll have to do something that'd be fun.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And then, we haven't talked about this yet. I was curious, like, what music do you listen to when you write? Like, I crank mine up. I've got to have those over ear headphones just to block out some noise. Like, what are you jamming on?
Well, probably three categories. Usually for me, it's like doom metal or stoner metal,
Yeah,
because like it has a sort of metronomic, very contemplative vibe, but it's also really sort of intense and interesting. But also jazz is another one that I really enjoy listening to.
hmm
Of course,
hmm
classical. I think in all of those categories, there's not a ton of verbiage.
Yeah,
Even in like some of the stoner rock or doom metal, it's much more musical and atmospheric than it is lyrical. So I think getting into that musical space where there aren't a lot of words, but there's tons of stimulation
hmm hmm
set up for
I
me.
I am just like, if anybody's just listening to this passively, like I am just cheesing right now about that metal stuff. It is, I mean, it just, yeah, like, I mean, we have to be careful, right? With like some of the people that are like bands that, have a lot of, I don't know, let's just say like nefarious messages and stuff like, but things like that. But absolutely. Like, I'm always like, okay, what are the bands that fall, have like, just really good composition and aren't doing like Nazism or something like that.
Right.
That is like but absolutely like wall of sound stuff. I love it. Yeah,
Yeah,
awesome.
anything with intense creative
Yeah,
instrumentation, musicality.
yeah, 100%. Excellent. Okay, so let's keep going. This is interesting. So one thing that we were talking about ahead of this is just trying to establish literature reviews and pub or conversations and intervening conversations, which I was saying at the top of the stream, like this is the hardest part for me when I'm writing, to just establish some territory or something like that. And so when you're in the thick of working wherever you are and whatever you're listening to, like writing a literature review, like what are strategies that work for you or have worked for you?
Oof, that's a tough one,
Yeah.
because literature reviews they're different depending on the sort of context in which you're
Yeah.
writing. Um, for me right now these days, I'm working on articles, journal articles, and so typically those. I mean, for me, the purpose of literature reviews and research articles, journal articles, is more so to sort of find your niche within a
Oh, excuse
particular.
me. Sorry about that pause. I got way too loud there. I don't know
Yeah,
why I
this is
did
the
that.
stuff you listen to for writing.
Yes, exactly.
uh, Well, no. So some of the research article literature reviews is just to sort of find your niche within a particular conversation where you agree, disagree, where you deviate, or
Hmm.
you adding, or you contesting, just sort of trying to establish the conversation that you're trying to have with people who have written on the same topic.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and so for me, I think any difficulty that I would have in writing literature reviews is mostly in trying to be comprehensive without being exhaustive. I think for
Yes.
me, research articles are more so about trying to represent the ideas you're presenting rather than the ideas that have already been presented in other instances.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
but you don't want to, you know, ignore things that have already been written. So it's just trying to find that balance between using things that have been written as a launch pad and a sort of frame for the work you want to represent or talk about in the article you're writing.
Absolutely. Like, what kind of conversations are you interested in right now with some of the stuff you've been working on?
Yeah, so the most recent article that I've submitted for two, I guess I can mention. The first is looking at Black theological rhetoric,
Yeah.
Jewish rhetorics, and the work of hip hop artist Kendrick Lamar.
Oh, yeah.
Um, and so that was pretty interesting because on the one hand, there is a sort of um, nascent, but I would say strong area of research, which I would call Kendrick studies,
Hmm.
where
Hmm.
you have uh,
Love it.
scholars of cultural studies, hip hop, rhetoric, pop culture, who study Kendrick Lamar for the purpose of whatever.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so that's pretty interdisciplinary. And so the difficulty there is probably trying to figure out, okay, how do I want to pull all of these different kinds of articles and research perspectives together. But for the sake of the article that I was writing, I was looking at, like I said, Black theological and Jewish rhetoric. And so
Hmm. Hmm.
also trying to put one area of focus, right? Kendrick studies in conversation with another, Black theological rhetoric, which is more of an historical and more established, but also pretty niche area of focus as well.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
but it was fun, right? Trying to, in a way, sort of update one while also historicizing the other.
Yeah. I mean, wow. Just to find that, like, that's one of the things I was talking about too earlier. Was just like, if something is very interdisciplinary, what do you acknowledge and what do you sort of just leave as like a yeah, citation, so to say, but that's about it, right? Like, it's I could imagine just pulling on these different like threads and so forth is real was challenging, but also just you're moving beyond the fields. Like, I don't think I've seen much in the study. Like, did you find much in writing studies and rhetoric about Kendrick Lamar, particularly? Or was it like did you say it was? Did I hear you say that it was mostly outside of the fields?
Yeah, I would say it's mostly outside. As I said, it's mostly more cultural
Yeah,
and social analysis,
yeah.
which has relevance certainly to writing studies. But I think that's part of what I was talking about in terms of trying to find a launch pad, right? So you
Mhm,
might say, to this point, much of the research has been in this area. This article seeks to intervene in Kendrick studies by discussing the ways in which these things can be applied to
mhm.
rhetoric or writing studies and so on and so forth. Um,
Excellent, yeah.
in terms of trying to find overlap between some of these interdisciplinary elements, one thing you could do is always narrow down the topic and trying to find throughout the vast interdisciplinary aspects what's common based upon your topic. So I was looking at rhetoric, I was looking at theology, and so you could
Mhm.
look through the articles that you find um, and see, okay, who's discussing theology, who's discussing rhetoric, and therein you can sort of begin to put together something a little more comprehensive.
Yeah, like this particular piece, it's right in that line, right, on,
Mhm.
theology and so forth, and what are they picking up or treating as a perhaps like a footnote, right? That you're like, well, wait a minute, let's dive a bit deeper into this particular gesture they have.
Right. And the thing that I always get from students is like, oh, I can't find anything about my topic whenever I do research. And I'm like, well, that's good. That's great, because
Yeah.
that's why it gives more relevance and credibility to your own work, right? If it hasn't been done already. And so it's good for me. A lot of times I'm happy when I don't find my own ideas represented as fully as I would like in existing literature.
Yeah. I didn't ask you this ahead of time, but I want to know if you have a similar feeling like with me, that it's hard for me to write that line. Little research has been done on this. I'm like, I think I know it, but I'm gonna try it. And I'm gonna see if they're like, you are full of it. But
well, has that ever happened to you? Has anybody ever called you out on the literature review?
No, but they've said like, you may want to consider this area. They're almost being additive to say like, okay, if you're going to support that, like what you could maybe do is say, I think somebody has said to me something similar to say like, you don't want to poke holes. You want to say, this is an opportunity to build on or something like that, and failed. So like, I find when I just get really, I don't know, when I have that assertion, it's every time I still just get a little, nervous about it. I don't know. But I think it's a good challenge to myself to like, oh, I'm going to assert this little research has been studied, has been presented on this topic. Here's how I'm going to back it up, without being exhaustive. I think that's the trick.
Right. Yeah. And I find some of the same stuff where reviewers or editors or people reading your stuff might say something like, oh, you might want to consider this author or this work. And a lot of times it's not like totally relevant or like totally like, okay, this shatters my idea or something like that. But, people have their own little perspectives on the field and on, certain kind of research.
Yeah. If every review I could find something about emotion, like I could do that and say, you didn't talk about this, but I'm like, that's not what your aim is on this. So I had to resist that a lot. Yeah. It's absolutely the biases we bring. Someone's asking in the chat, I just wrote that line in my paper right now. Okay. Hi, Stefan. Yeah, that's great. What was the line that you wrote? By the way, you'll have to tell us. It's great. And then Metacognitive Diaries was going to ask, how do you get past the feeling that you don't know enough, haven't read enough, or haven't researched enough to start? That's a great question. I think that's kind of tracks with what we were just talking about, but I don't know. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I don't think it ever changes.
I
think especially if you're someone who is really concerned about these types of things, there's always that feeling that maybe I've missed something or, I need to do more. A couple of things to keep in mind is, one, you could always read more. Like there's an endless, there's endless words in the world. You can continue to read as much as you want. But if you don't have the time, you don't have the time. And so you have to think about the constraints of the time, the forum in which you're writing. And for me, sometimes it's best to just say, okay, I'm going to limit the literature review to a paragraph, 2 pages, 3 pages, whatever it is, and just be okay with those limitations. And if there's an issue that comes up later in revision, then that's okay. The other thing perhaps is that the point of the literature review is not to be exhaustive. The point is to use it to support your own ideas and your own work. And then the other thing is the big ones. So the major authors, or you could do more of a state-of-the-art review in which you're looking at the most recent stuff. So that's also some strategies you can use where it's like, okay, there's a ton of it, so let me just look at the most cited or what seems to be the big authors or the big papers. And there's also, well, let me just look at the most recent stuff. On the topic.
And I don't think that scholars want you to, because like to Chris's point, don't want you to do the exhaustive work because they want you to basically present your original data, right? So like this slit review is a bit longer than I would like. I remember we were trying to work through it. I mean, but it's really not that long. Like if you think about actually, yeah, if I really think about it, that is, let me just add this up real fast because I'm curious. Like sometimes I'll just say 1,000 words. That's all you get like on this, you know, and having those limitations sometimes helps you shape the article itself or how much you're going to bring in. But I've done this before too. I thought this was useful. I'd said in a productive way, saying I don't have time to discuss all of these things, but here are the main subtopics I'm interested in. But yeah, that's just such a great point that you have to say. I'm going to talk with about the most recent scholarship, right? Like much is built on Azizi Papatrizi's piece I'm looking at here. Like there's been a lot on affect, but she's specifically talking about affect and social media.
Yeah.
And like, if I wanted to define all of affect, like I could, but instead I'm just working with hers and because she's, worked more closely with that. And I think that's sometimes the problem with citation is like, if we just keep going back to Aristotle, it's just going to continue to be cited, and that's interesting. But so many people have built on Aristotle since antiquity, so why not work at the most recent scholarship? Yeah, I hope that answers your question, Metacognitive. Thanks for that comment too, Chris. And this is what Stefan wrote. So yeah, there's been little research on X to justify my direction. Yeah, like put it out there, start that point, and then you could like sort of tinker with that line in a more sophisticated way, as you continue to build that topic.
Yeah, and if you're uncomfortable saying there's little research done, you can always say, while X, Y, and Z have presented significant research on X, Y, or Z, my own research, intervenes or deviates in this way. So you don't always have to sort of, if you're uncomfortable with contextualizing or characterizing the field, you can always sort of go the opposite way, where instead of saying, oh, there's been little research, you can say, while there's been research done. You can sort of neutralize the language a little bit.
Yeah. And, I think that's one thing I haven't quite encountered yet is sometimes I've heard of scholars who have like a particular topic or literature will be citing someone pretty regularly, will actually get reviewed by that person that they're, so to say, like critiquing or pointing out. And, it can be very productive, but it's also a risk. So I don't know. Like, I think that's when you're just saying like, this person has failed. It's little there's a little risk there sometimes. So that's a great construct. I just put that in the chat too, as you were talking. Okay. So, we were talking about our respective conferences and kind of going to them, and one thing that's occurred to me for this conversation and others is briefly acknowledging like a scholarly conversation. I think those appear often in abstracts and proposal writing. I was wondering if you wanted to talk about one of your recent abstracts that you submitted to like a journal or a conference. If it's it depends on sort of what you feel comfortable with, like with sharing. But if you have like a prop or anything of that sort that you've worked to, maybe we could look at it together and I could show you one of mine as well.
Yeah. I don't know how we want to do it, if I share my screen or if I just email it to you, but we can look at the one that was accepted for technical communication.
Sure. Yeah, you can. Yeah, feel free to email it. I could just pop it up on here at that point. I think. I don't know if you can screen share on here. Does it give you an option to do that?
It does.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we could. Yeah, if you want to, we could. It's the Wild West, like YouTube. So, if you want to try, yeah, absolutely. Like, let's see what does that. Okay, then we got there. There we go. Okay, cool.
You see that? Okay.
Yeah, it's just if we enlarge it just a little bit, that'd be great. Okay, cool.
Yeah, so this was a proposal for an article that I submitted to Technical Communication, a special issue looking at diversity in the workplace.
Hmm.
And so this was based upon some of my dissertation research where I look at sort of rhetorics of participation related to diversity as it was
Hmm.
applied in federal housing development. And so here, you get a little title. I'm sure it'll change at some point. Uh,
Hmm.
but here is, in the beginning, some of the literature review moves. I wouldn't necessarily call this a literature review, but it's some of the moves that are usually applied within abstracts and proposals.
Hmm.
So if we look here at the top, we have social justice and technical communication values participation as a promising framework for bringing about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then I have a few citations here.
Hmm.
I feel that this citation here is appropriate because I'm referencing development within the field
Hmm.
in that sentence. And the next one, critics in numerous fields, however, have questioned the effectiveness of participatory methodologies to support the most at-risk stakeholders. And so again, I'm sort of framing and providing a launch pad for my own ideas down below by having a sort of mini discussion about the field, multiple
Hmm.
fields for this literature review move.
Hmm.
Um, for me, I like to establish the controversy early in the text, um,
Hmm.
developing a sort of tension, right? So on one hand, we have participation is great, but on the other, we have maybe not so great. And so now that I've established the controversy in that first little bit, now I'm going to intervene within that controversy, and that's how I'll frame my own work. So as a
Hmm.
case, this article evaluates participation, et cetera, et cetera. And then I restate the controversy, um, and then finally
Hmm.
go more in depth about my actual work. So for me, um, this particular literature review or this literature review technique was mostly about, okay, there's a controversy happening. My work or this article is in service to resolving that controversy or adding another
Hmm.
element into the issue at hand.
Hmm. Fantastic. Yeah, I can't wait to read that. Like, you're using that case to weigh what might be at stake for participatory methods and TechCom. Yeah.
And the other thing is that, so me, that these are more recent participatory methodologies and participatory development. I mean, that you can find evidence and research on that going back, mid 20th century for sure. But I stay relatively recent. The other thing about this one is that, and you can speak on this, Rich, if you have an opinion, but I use scholars within technical communication, but also scholars that were mentioned in the call for papers.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so just again, thinking about using the literature review not as exhaustive, but as thinking about relevancy and application.
Yeah. Like, you could say, what's the relevance of this topic? And you could say, how does that figure into what I'm trying to say, or what it's strategically using those sources like you would, yeah, in many places, because you want it to be your voice.
Yeah.
And I think that is like as we were talking about earlier, that is the challenge of, I think, for undergraduates, is inserting yourself in your own, your ideas here, after you've established that territory. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. That sounds that yeah, I can't wait to read that piece. Okay, I have a couple more questions for you. Do you still have a few minutes? I'm sorry I always love these conversations, and they always like go a little bit over. I'm sorry if you have
No, you're good.
something. Okay, cool. Yeah. Okay, so one of the things that I'm fascinated by, and in this conversation of literature reviews, is how it might relate to anti-racist writing. We've seen things like Communication So White, and special issues that have looked critically at citation practices and so forth. And I think if we just keep revisiting the same historical sources, what they're kind of asserting here, I think, as well, is there's this issue of underrepresentation, right? That's one reason I was very interested in bringing you in, because tomorrow you're giving your final workshop on anti-racist writing and translingualism and so forth. Yeah. And I just wanted to know, and this is something we had been talking about ahead of time, was, to what extent do you think anti-racist writing is an intervention in academic writing, or to what extent is it in different ways? Like, how could these kind of principles that you're going to talk about in the workshop, how could they shape how we compose a lit review, do you think?
Yeah, that's really interesting. The workshop tomorrow, I usually sort of gear it toward undergraduates. It's usually, I call it an introduction because some of it is relatively rudimentary, but I think really helpful for beginning to think about, on the one hand, anti-racism as being aware and cognizant of the language that we use within our own writing. And then translingualism, that aspect of it, was thinking about how can we incorporate our own linguistic background into demands for academic English. And so if we were to sort of extrapolate that to literature reviews, on the one hand, I think the most basic form of that would be something like lending credence and credibility to all kinds of scholars in terms of race, gender, sexuality, who have done work in the field, but have also done work to intervene within the field. So really, I think, on the one hand, thinking about literature itself as an ongoing conversation and not necessarily as something that is static, right? So if we think, okay, I'm going to write a literature review and I'm only going to look at the big authors from before 1970, because I think that's the big, most important foundational scholars. That's not reality. Nowadays, over the last 30, 40, 50 years, people have had a lot of different kinds of conversations within the field. So when you do a literature review, I think in incorporating anti-racist writing, it's thinking about what other types of conversations are happening that have shaped the field, shaped my own work. So I think it's important to have a broader understanding of what the conversation internally looks like within a particular field or research area.
Yeah.
The other aspect is sometimes, and this has come up many times in the workshop, is some students feel uncomfortable when they encounter racist or outdated language in some of the older sources. And so some of the strategies we look at in the workshop itself is, what do we do about how do we handle such language? The main sort of strategy we talk about in the workshop is just calling it out for what it is. Depending on the length of your literature review and sort of the critical nature of the literature review, you may or may not have a ton of space for it. But it's always something to keep in mind, is that when you encounter outdated or racist material in citing sources or examining sources, it's important to contextualize it and call it out, and make sure that it's not reflective of your own work, hopefully.
Yeah, the Lucille Schultz archive at University of Cincinnati has all these classic, late 19th century, early 20th century sort of composition textbooks, and there are lots of citations about savages and like examples of they'll say like rural people speak, how they speak, and things like that. And it's that your comment reminded me of that, like that might be a good place to just look at retroactively or retrospectively and sort of use that as the critique. The article itself could be an entire lit review of those texts. Then might be interesting to think about. Okay, so do you mind if I turn to this one slide that's in your thing? It's on basically when we're thinking about conversations, you have this really great piece in here where you're talking about how we cite languages in addition to English. Do you mind if I turn to that?
Yeah, I think, yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. No, there's a piece. I mean, it's very what it reminds me of is, and I wanted to get your thought on this, is what if do we have an opportunity, you think, in lit reviews to work with languages other than our own? So I'm thinking about like emotion studies. There was likely so much beyond, English language published journals that could be really useful. And I've kind of grappled with that. I mean, I've been grappling with that a lot in my head. Like, what am I missing from this? And I guess what's your take on, maybe moving out of what we might think of as like, our home language or native language into citing other sources that are beyond our own?
That's a really hard question.
Yeah.
Mostly because, I speak a little bit of something else, but I'm not entirely fluent, and so
Yeah.
It'd be not necessarily irresponsible, but it'd be kind of hard to work with the same level of credibility, right? In terms of representing and discussing ideas that appear in different languages. Now, of course, a lot of work has been translated, right?
Right.
But the thing is, translation of work that has been published in different languages, it's usually vetted in some way by experts in translation studies and language. So I do think it's important to acknowledge and to work with sources and research that does not happen in North America, right? So that's a big one. But in terms of, how, if you are not fluent in another language, how do you incorporate other languages? That's tricky.
Yeah.
Because you also don't want to misrepresent how language is used and contextualized in a different area.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's been my hesitation for doing that. Right. It's while we have this sort of two national languages, especially in Canada, like maybe there's an opportunity, but I'm not quite well versed in that. That's in French just yet. So working on it. Maybe that's a sabbatical project. We'll see.
Yeah.
Okay, Chris. So go ahead.
I do think just as a person who likes reading and writing, I love reading in other languages and doing sort of ad hoc translation just as an exercise. But in terms of like representing it as, me being an expert on it, that's a little bit different.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, Chris, I really appreciate your time hanging out with us for a bit to talk about your writing and literature reviews and all approaches. Do you want to tell us what else you're working on right now? And things like that, whether it's in teaching, research, etc.
Yeah, sure. I mentioned the Kendrick Lamar paper. I'll be presenting that at the Popular Culture Association conference in San Antonio next month. Dr. Laura Allen and I, who's also in the writing department, she and I were just at a conference in Chicago interviewing Black faculty in composition studies about their experiences with mentorship in their graduate and professional experiences. So yeah, that's what I'm working on nowadays. What about you, Rich? I know you were just in, what was it, Iceland or Norway?
Norway. Yeah. It's been, it was great. I learned a lot while I was out there and did some presentations and things of that sort. So getting ready for computers and writing now, going to, Davis, University of California, Davis in June. So I've got a little bit of time, but I think right now I'm in that research territory space, just trying to think about the next projects, like the next major project I want to pursue. And it's been a little challenging, I think, but I'm gonna relish in the idea of just breathing in and taking many different texts and just listening to different conversations out in the field and searching for them, kind of stopping in at different parlors, so to say, and seeing like what people are saying.
Right, exactly. And so tying it back to literature reviews, for those interested in academia, research never stops. So
yeah, we're always thinking. I feel like we're, I've got to be really, maybe it's the music or it's gaming or something that helps me like cleave off that thinking sometimes. I'm like, I don't want to think, stop, but It's been good. Well, all the best with that conference and your projects too. That sounds fantastic. I can't wait to especially hear more about this collaboration you've got with Dr. Laura Allen. Like, she was on the Big Rhetorical podcast talking about that very project. So definitely check that out if you all haven't you've seen it. It's fantastic. But yeah, other than that, have a great rest of the day and happy finishing up the semester.
Yeah, you too. Thanks a lot, and thanks all for tuning in.
Yep. All right. We'll talk to you soon.
Yeah.
Bye. All right. What a fantastic chat with Dr. Christopher Morris. Really appreciate catching up. You know, we all have all of our things going on all the time here in the department. You know, and it's hard to catch up, right? Especially if we're just doing a little bit of teaching and most of our positions are about doing research. You know, it gets lonely out there sometimes, just being in your head and being with the literature. So I always get energized by these conversations with my peers in the department, and even outside of the stream, you know, coffee hours and stuff. That is its own kind of intervention into research. I think is just talking on ideas. So we have just a couple minutes left, but as always, I like to cut for just a 1 minute, 2 minute break because I've been talking a lot. And again, part of the research process, I can't say this enough, is actually taking care of yourself. Whether you're sitting and reading all kinds of different books, you're immersed in this kind of conversation, it can get very exhausting. So let's turn to just a quick break. Be right back to wrap a couple things up. All right, there we go. Hi, myself. Okay, folks, I am back, and let's talk about a couple things coming up on the stream. So again, fantastic conversation with Dr. Christopher Morris. Big shout out to him. Thanks for coming to join us for the stream. Again, lots of energy to be had when you have these conversations. And it just reminds me too, you know, as you're working on these final projects, don't forget, you know, you always have an option, I think we do, to talk to folks, to just say, here's what my idea is. what I think I want to do with this project and where I think I am with my literature review. Building those kind of peer networks to help each other find more sources and things like that. We get so entrenched in our own kind of thinking when we're doing these kind of citation practices and building the lit that, I often ask my peers after I've done a little bit of work into an area, I'll say, do you have any suggestions for what to add? Or is there anything I'm kind of missing from this? And I think that I'm always having a few more. And I think when you do peer review, that's when your peers can suggest sources. That is a common thing you'll see in lit reviews. Like, you might want to think about this source as well. And so it's not as a means to critique you, so to say, but to help you make a more comprehensive and interesting lit review. As I was talking with Chris, I had this idea that I wanted to put to you all that may be useful. If you're thinking about like how to cite and begin to compose a comprehensive review other than the strategies we had. I did this for a bit when I was working on my dissertation. Let me see if I can find it. But I could make a kind of version of it, essentially. If we started a doc, what we could do is, blank page, you're like, I'm interested in this topic, right? So let's say like city cycling. That's one of the main ideas, I've been talking to you all about. What I could do is go to Google Scholar, right? And let's just say I'll say city cyclists. And change this to me. Okay, there we go. So what I might do at the very beginning while I'm building up this lit review is start grabbing a couple different sources. And here's another one. Let's just say I'm doing this live. I'm gonna show you some thinking as I do it. Right. This is the means of invention, so to say. And it's international overview cycling trends in Western Europe. Okay, let's just keep grabbing them. Now, a lot of these are largely in the 2000s, which is good. We want to be, what I'm already noticing is when I start to look at these a lot of these are from the same book, right? So I've got to be kind of careful about that. The nice thing is, let's just say, if I'm making the claim that in the last 3 years, literature and scholarship on cycling has taken off, that gives me a filter. That's already one I can work with. So if I were doing that, let's say last 3 years, we'll say 2019. Anything that's been cited since 2019, what could I work with? That's okay. So we're there. So we would take out this one. We would take out this one. Okay, so we can start looking at it from here. Again, I'm not so much saying it's a literature review, but I'm doing literature searching. What's been out there? Okay, so cycling behaviors in various cities. See what else we could look at. Maturing urban cycling, various motivators. Okay, so they're looking at particular. I'm already seeing a few things. This is largely about European cities. Okay, New York City, we have that. So we're finding a lot of things that are in the last 3 years. This gives us a fresh insights. All right, so I'm gonna get up to 10, okay, and then we'll sort of go from there. Okay. Smart cycling futures. This is like green streets. I can relate to this because that's what we have in GTA, particularly in Vaughan. I live. let's go here and look at our last one. We've got how many so far? 1, 2, 3. Oh, excuse me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. There, and then 2 more. Go with this one. And one more. Politics of cycling in infrastructure. So this gets a bit more in the weeds. We'll try this one. Okay. So, you know, lots of different things I can pull out. Now, I'm looking at this and I just said city cyclists, right? If I want to keep searching just so I can try to get closer to a lit review, maybe what I can do here is I could say city cyclists and rhetoric. And if I just look through this quickly, maybe seeing some stuff. Cycling the city. Okay. Representation in French media. That might be interesting to think of. Not quite sure. I'm letting my curiosities. Building the second campaign for a just city. Okay, so quickly, I might be able to claim I'm not seeing much in this, but this looks interesting too. Like what Jacob Green may have been looking at. So, I mean, I can bookmark some of these things. So right now, what my headspace is getting me towards is I've looked at this topic and I haven't seen much on rhetoric and cycling. Now I need to confirm whether that's true. So I could kind of this. I could start looking at the problem we have with this is if we're saying cycling, some people might say like a cycle of rhetoric, which is not what I'm after. But I'm thinking, wow, that's an interesting term I could be putting together. So we'll say bicycle rhetoric, see what we could find. Anti-Chinese rhetoric tied to racism against Asian Americans. Stop hate report. What is this? Okay. Interesting. Okay. Okay, so this is a general view of some of that. Rhetorical orientations for promoting sustainable travel behavior, a perspective. Okay. We're starting to get there. What I'm not seeing is something like, see, another way to kind of intervene is we could look at, like we're getting into gaming and stuff, so we're not quite where we need to be with this. So we could say something like, I'm going to look up Sarah Hallenbeck's book. She has one on cycling. We'll try that. Claiming the bicycle. Okay, so we'll take this one. That was what I was interested in. Let's look at this, and then let's go here. Oh, interesting. It doesn't come up as an idea here. Okay. I go, yeah, because of what I could do here is look at citations of her piece to see like what's been built on since then. That was 2019 when it came out. We got one citation here. Interesting. So there's a couple different things I could think about. Like I could do running and writing. What does it mean to run and write? What does it mean to cycle and write? I don't know. So what I'm trying to stress here basically is when you are doing these reviews, the search part it's a hard part to pull on, right? What are the keywords you're working with? And if you're not finding much, maybe that's a good sign, as Chris suggested. So I don't know. It's possible to find some. Do I use Google Scholar because it's not limited to what the library is subscribed to? Yeah, I tend to pair both. And in my research methods chat that I gave last week, that's what I was suggesting, is kind of pairing together what you see in libraries versus Google Scholar. Because if you're on the library system already, like I'm on campus right now, if I find something through Google Scholar, likely it will know that I'm on campus or within that system, and they give it to me anyways. I find that, like, if I can access it directly through Google Scholar, that I can go to your libraries, especially if I'm off campus, and then log in and find that source. That said, like, I just found a ton of sources on cycling that were just available and didn't show up in the search result I looked at through the Google Scholar. So we'll say cycling and another thing I didn't look up, right? What's out there? So that's very specific, some of the stuff we're looking at now. So I'll say like bicycling cities for that. I mean, yeah, we get all kinds of different stuff. And so like, I'm probably not going to be citing things like health sort of studies and things like that, like related to the body, but more or less like, you know, things like urban cycling handbooks and things like that that might be useful for this approach. That's a good question though. Like, what do we pull on for doing that literature search? Okay, so that was just like a secondary part of what we can think about for literature review writing. It's a tough thing, but you know, it eventually shakes out once we've done that deep thinking and we've strategically used sources. That is the difficult thing to do. So I just want to wrap up things for now. Let's turn back to what's coming up the next few weeks. So March 29th, Writing as I'm Presenting. We'll be talking with Christina LaVecchia about presenting and how scientific communication prompted her to think about the presentation and delivery of materials in an upcoming edited collection that she's putting together with her colleagues. And then we'll speak on April 5th with Carrie Ann Soto-Vega about writing as in composing yourself. So as always, thanks for joining us here for the stream. Love the conversation we had today with Dr. Christopher Morris and the many conversations we had earlier in the term. If you'd like to check any of those out, they're linked up here and hyperlinked. So feel free to peruse those as you see fit. They're on demand and aren't going away anytime soon. And we're also making kind of condensed versions of a number of interviews as well as part of a class project. So you can expect that as well in the future. Until next time, though, we'll speak to you and have a great rest of the week. Bye.